This week's reading is Living in the Presence of God. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 25, we read of a king, capitalized, for the reference is to God, who welcomed certain devotees to the divine consciousness, saying, I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me. The elect asked him when it was that they served him these ways. And the king answered, Verily I say unto you, insomuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. To see God as residing in every human being, as indeed he does, is to open oneself to limitless opportunities for serving him. Paramahansa Yogananda, in Autobiography of a Yogi, described a saint who lived in this consciousness as the greatest man of humility I ever knew. He described a seemingly chance encounter with this saint. Another day found me walking alone near the Hallrath railroad station. I stood for a moment by a temple, silently criticizing a small group of men with drums and cymbals who were violently reciting a chant. How undevotionally they used the Lord's divine name in mechanical repetition, I reflected. My gaze was astonished by the rapid approach of Master Mahashaya. Sir, how come you here? The saint, ignoring my question, answered my thought. Isn't it true, little sir, that the beloved's name sounds sweet from all lips, ignorant and wise? He passed his arm around me affectionately. I found myself carried on his magic carpet to the merciful presence. If you would see God, watch for him everywhere. If you would hear his voice, listen for it in all sounds and also in their supporting silences. If you would know God, seek his wisdom behind merely human knowledge. The Bhagavad Gita in the 6th chapter states, One who beholds my presence everywhere and in all things dwelling equally in me, he never loses loving sight of me, nor I of him for all eternity. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
Morning, everyone. As we get closer to Christmas, we get to contemplate topics like living in the presence of God. It goes deeper and deeper. And as I was preparing for this yesterday, I came across that story of Paramahansa Yogananda's, whose teachings we practice here, where he's sitting in a railroad car in a small compartment with this one other person who we recognized as a famous actor. And he could tell by the expression on the face that the actor was not pleased to be sharing this railroad car with him. This was in the 30s or 40s or something. And he kept sort of grimacing over at him. And finally he engaged him in conversation, and the man sort of reluctantly, sort of with a sneer, responded a little bit. And then Yogananda said, everyone in the world is a little bit crazy, but they don't know it. because they tend to gravitate to other people who share their craziness. And so this guy just starts roaring with laughter. That sort of broke the ice. And he ensued in a conversation, and he said, why don't we have a wager? He said, you tell me a little bit about life as an actor and try to inspire me to see if I want to live that way and if I'll be happy that way. He said, and if I am, I'll follow you. And he said, and I'll tell you a little bit about my life as a lover of God and how to do that. And then he has a little line in there, something about, and this is a rare opportunity for you. Indeed, there's a guru sitting right there, an avatar talking to you about God. And he said, and if you find happiness that way, then you follow me. And then he said, needless to say, I did not become an actor. And this man came along. But I love that image of everyone in the world is a little bit crazy. And we each have our individual craziness that way. I remember growing up as a young child, little girl, and my parents, as most people, would have opinions about different people in our lives, aunts and uncles and friends and so on. And they would express those opinions strongly. And as a young child, you're influenced. And so I got the impression, people were in those boxes that my parents had put them in. And then when I grew up and I got to know those people in their own right, you might say, I found out they didn't fit in that box at all. And I had a completely different impression of them. And that's generally what happens in the world, whether it's nations, whether it's races, whether it's cultures, whatever grouping we're in, families, we tend to form these opinions and judgments, and one sort of layers upon another. But living in the presence of God, of our highest nature, of our soul nature, we begin to view everyone as a soul and not define them by their outer circumstances, their personalities, their bodies, their color, whatever it might be. About 10 years ago now, Riemann and I visited Swami Kriyananda, Ananda's founder and Yogananda's direct disciple. And he was living in India at the time. And we didn't know it, but the day we arrived, he had a medical test scheduled. Something had come up. And as it turned out, it was a colonoscopy and there was cancer. And so shortly after that, he had surgery, and we were with him through those entire couple of weeks when all that took place. So he took us with him to his exam, to the test. And it was in a beautiful, very clean, very large, very modern hospital. But typical to India, everything is always crowded. So in this waiting room, we were waiting. It was packed with people. We were sort of all squished together. And we were sitting next to a Muslim family. And Swami Kriyananda engages them in conversation, as he often would with people wherever he goes, and finds out that they were from the northern part of Bengal, which is where his guru Yogananda was from, and he had learned from his guru a little bit of Bengali. And so he starts talking to them very nicely, sweetly in Bengali, and then Kriyananda suddenly bursts into song, a Bengali song that his guru had taught him, which was a devotional song to Krishna, which is not exactly what the Muslims would be practicing. But they were so touched by that genuine love and expression that he was having. They were moved to tears. And then Kriyananda starts talking to them about, he had just finished writing Yogananda's commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, and it had just been published, and he had it with him, and he starts telling them about it, and he starts reading through them, and they were just enamored by him, completely melting in. They also could sense that he was somebody special, but they were completely melted, and the difference is whether Muslim or Hindu, it didn't matter. It was just God loving God, and he drew back what he was giving, which was just genuine kindness. Well, when it did turn out to be cancer, as I said, and he had a surgery, and he always liked to go home early from the hospital for his surgeries, and he didn't like staying there. So he finally, went home, and a few of us took him home, and he was very weak. He was in his early 80s at this point. He was very weak, and we sat him on a chair at the bottom of the stairs because there's this long, steep stairway to the second floor where his bedroom was. And he sat there for a few minutes, and he just was radiant. And he just said, I feel so much bliss, only bliss. And he could hardly speak. And then he got up, and he started to try to go up the stairs, and a couple of the men immediately, went to steady him and help him because he was very, very weak. And he got up the first step or two, and then he just bounded up the stairs by himself. He just sort of unshackled himself from his helpers, bound up the stairs like a deer. It was just amazing to see. And it was like he was saying without saying, I am not this body, and I'm experiencing bliss. And he just soared right up those stairs, just not giving too much credence to the outer form and the outer circumstance and the outer situation, and living constantly in that soul nature. And those were inspirational stories to me to watch this illustrated. But I know there are things that happen in life that aren't that easy. They aren't pleasant, kind people sitting in waiting rooms that we try to tune into. Life can be, there's ugliness, there's brutality, there's unkindness. Recently, Riemann and I watched a movie about the life of Richard Wurmbrand. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but we had not only read a book by him, he was a Romanian priest. He'd actually been born Jewish, but he converted and he became a priest in Christianity. And he and his wife both had a ministry, and he was quite outspoken in Romania at the time that the communists were in the rule there about the atheism of communism and the dangers of that. And so at a certain point, he was arrested because he was too outspoken. And he was thrown into prison, and their goal seemed to be to dissuade him of his spiritual life. And so they kept torturing him to try to get him to disown Christ, who was his guru. And he describes these horrific tortures that he went through, and he had holes in his body where he got beaten with sticks, and he had burns, and they really for 8 years he was in a solitary little room. But he describes how he would clank together his chains and sing God's name once they left him in his room, and how he would, he could hear the other Christians who were imprisoned in other rooms, and they would sing. And he described at a certain point, about halfway through the 8-year imprisonment, just experiencing only ecstasy. And the ecstasy was so profound that he loved his torturers. It was so profound that he converted some of his torturers. And one got the head guy to sign among many other papers. He sort of slipped one in. That was the paper that let him out of prison. And then he and his wife went and lectured around the world trying to, make others aware of the Christian plight there and also raise funds. Well, they came to Grass Valley, California, and we got to see him in the late 70s near Ananda Village in California, and met him, and Swami Kriyananda met him also. And it was so inspiring to meet someone who was able to overcome all the atrocities of the outward circumstances that he was in and experience only God's presence and God's joy. There's another story I won't go into, but it was meaningful to me. I was born Dutch in a Dutch country and Jewish, and most of my father's family was killed during the war in concentration camps. And I grew up meeting my aunt who had numbers, emblazoned on her hands, and she was broken by that. The rest of her life was sort of a bitter, sad person. So that was my image of those horrors. But then I read a book called The Hiding Place about a woman, Corrie ten Boom, and she went through the same circumstances, but she became freer and freer spiritually. She rose above the circumstances. And her sister said, there is no pit so deep that God isn't deeper still. And so we can see by those examples, these are not necessarily extraordinary people. These are people like you and like me. And that's their point, that we can experience this for ourselves. And once we uplift our soul, uplift our consciousness into our soul nature, we get like a bird's eye view of life that allows us to see everything for what it is and know our own divinity, know our own soul nature, and soar in that. So that what might otherwise be horrific tests become simply other opportunities for upliftment. We see it all as the same. That's why Christ on the cross, if we relate to that, it must be horrible. And yet he was in an ecstatic state. He wasn't relating to it in the state that we would when we're not uplifted into Christ consciousness. Yogananda came to show us that each and every one of us have the potential for that divine experience within us. There's a story of a guru in India who one day just started hurling bricks at his disciples. And they all fled and ran away. And this one disciple stood and he picked up the brick and he thought, my guru touched this. And he threw it to me, so it must be blessed. And he clutched it to his chest and he brought it home and he put it on his altar. And when he opened his eyes, it had turned to gold. Because there is a blessing in every literal and figurative brick that comes into our lives because it is all from God. So that's practicing the presence in other people and relating in life to ourselves and to others. But then there's our activities. And I can't talk on this topic without touching on Brother Lawrence, who was a great Christian mystic a couple of centuries ago. And he said for him, he was a simple monk, he was illiterate, he worked in the kitchen in the monastery where he lived. And he said for him there was no difference between, as he put it, being in the business of the kitchen or being in prayer and meditation. And he talked about in the kitchen things would be clattering and several people would be shouting for things at the same time. And he would experience the same tranquility of God's presence as he would in prayer and meditation, because he kept it constant. And another great Christian mystic saint was the Curé d'Ars in France, also a couple of centuries ago. Also a simple priest, also illiterate, although he had to learn enough to be able to become a priest. And that's basic. He got coached and he got in and that was it. But he was a great lover of God. And people started, he lived in a small village, and people started talking about him. And before you knew it, people were coming from miles and miles and miles around. Thousands of people would come on pilgrimage just to be in his presence. And he said that in the early years, he would always pray and meditate. He would meditate, he used that word, each morning. He said, but then once so many hordes of people started coming, there was no more time. But he would wake up in the morning and he would unite his soul with his Guru, Christ, in prayer. And then he would go about his activities in memory of that unity. They make it sound so simple. If you've tried to do this, you know. Yogananda gives us this very simple formula. He says, think about God before you act. Think about God while you're performing the action. And think about God when you've completed the action. Which is a tricky way of thinking about God all the time. Really, when you think about it. And he said, for those who think me near, I will be near, which is what the Curé d'Ars experienced. He saw himself in union with his Guru and did everything throughout the day in reflection on that union. That's the fine art of it. And it begins for each and every one of us with meditation. And all of these traditions have meditation as their centerpiece in one form or another. And so at Ananda, we follow Paramahansa Yogananda's guidance on this. And he started the all-day Christmas meditation way back when he first came to this country. A whole day, 8 hours dedicated in meditation, prayer, chanting, uplifting music. A day to just dive deep into the spirit of the season. And in that spirit, in reflection of that spirit, go through the hustle bustle of activities, social activities that take place, and bring that spirit to them. And what I find with the Christmas meditation, which is next Saturday, by the way, and it starts at 10, is that it's a reboot for the whole year, not just for Christmas. So it's highly recommend you coming. I'm supposed to say for all or part, but I really encourage you to consider all because there's such a great blessing in it. But absolutely, if you can't, come for part because the blessings are tangible.
Let's take a few moments to listen to these words from Yogananda's Book of Prayer Demands. O Divine Father, thou art just behind my prayer. Why dost thou seem so far away? Thou dost tremble in my feelings. Thy presence glimmers through the veil of my thoughts, yet dost thou seem so far away. Father, come, remove thy veil. Come, Father, come, hear the voice of my prayer. I want to know thee, to talk to thee, to hear thee speak to me. I want to pray to thee and know that thou dost hear my prayer. Show me the way that leads to thee. I'd like to give you an opportunity